Today, we're digging into a part of American history that, often gets skipped over. It's the story of how winning a revolution, the biggest victory imaginable, actually brought the new United States to the very brink of total bankruptcy. And believe it or not, that financial chaos is what led to the country we know today. Seriously, just think about that for a second. What if you won the war, you beat this global superpower, you secured your independence? The parties are epic. But then the dust settles and you realize you're completely broke. Not just a little short on cash, but staring down a catastrophic economic collapse. Well, that's exactly where the United States found itself in the 1780s. Yeah, that victory over Great Britain, it came with a massive price tag. And I'm not just talking about lives lost. I'm talking about borrowed money, IOUs, and a whole flood of paper currency that was becoming more worthless by the day. The American dream of freedom was slamming right into the harsh reality of an economic nightmare. So just how bad was it? Let's get into the nitty-gritty, because the new nation wasn't just in debt. It was literally drowning in it. Just look at the scale of this mess. We're not talking about one simple national debt. The United States owed huge amounts to its allies in Europe, France, Spain, the Netherlands. On top of that, each individual state had racked up its own massive debts. And to make matters even worse, the money they were printing to try and pay for all of this, it was becoming basically monopoly money. And that brings us to the infamous continental currency. The government printed so much of it that its value just plummeted. You know the old saying, not worth a continental? That comes from this period. It meant something was utterly, completely worthless. This was more than just an economic problem, right? It was a crisis of confidence. I mean, if you can't even trust your own government's money, what can you trust? Which leads to the big question, why couldn't the government just, fix it? Well, the simple answer is, it was never designed to. In fact, it was designed to be weak. Think about it. After fighting a whole war against what they saw as the tyranny of King George III, the last thing Americans wanted was to create their own powerful, centralized government. So their first shot at a constitution, the Articles of Confederation, created a national government that was, by design, incredibly weak. All the real power was left with the states. And this right here, this is the fatal flaw. Under the Articles, Congress could do things like declare war, but it couldn't raise taxes to pay for an army. It could borrow money, but it had no real way to pay it back. It could see states fighting over trade, but it couldn't step in to regulate it. It was a government with all of the responsibility and almost none of the actual power. So the takeaway here is crucial. This wasn't just a string of bad luck. The system was basically set up to fail at managing a national economy. The one tool every government needs to function, the power to raise money, was off the table. The country was just adrift in a sea of debt, and there was nobody at the wheel. And, as you can probably guess, things started to unravel fast. The economic weakness started to create real political and social chaos, and it pushed the young nation right to its breaking point. It was like a domino effect of one crisis after another. The states started acting like bitter rivals, slapping tariffs on each other's goods. The national deficit just kept getting bigger and bigger. Foreign countries like Britain and Spain had zero respect for a nation that couldn't pay its bills. American ships were being attacked by pirates, and there was no navy to protect them. And even the soldiers who fought the revolution started to mutiny because they weren't getting paid. By 1786, things really came to a head. A meeting was called in Annapolis to try and solve these awful trade disputes between the states. But it was a total failure. Most states didn't even bother to show up. And right after that attempt at diplomacy failed, public anger boiled over into open rebellion. And that was Shays' Rebellion. Here's the story. Farmers, many of them guys who had just fought in the Revolution, came home to find themselves in crushing debt. Then, to pay its own war debts, the Massachusetts government jacked up taxes. Taxes these farmers had no way to pay. So when the courts started seizing their farms, they did what they'd learned to do in the Revolution. They grabbed their guns and shut the courts down. Shays' Rebellion was the wake-up call. It absolutely terrified the nation's leaders, people like George Washington. They looked around and saw the country falling into total anarchy, not even able to handle a small-scale revolt. It was the final, undeniable proof that the Articles of Confederation had failed, and the nation was about to fall apart. Okay, so the country is on fire. This fear, this threat of total collapse, is what finally spurred people to action. They realized that tinkering with the Articles wasn't going to cut it. They needed something totally new, something radical. And so, in 1787, delegates from the states were called to Philadelphia. Now, this was not some quiet philosophical debate club. This was an emergency meeting to save a country from failing. The real motivation wasn't abstract ideas. It was the cold, hard reality of economic collapse and political chaos. Their to-do list was pretty clear, and it was basically a direct response to everything that had just gone wrong. They had to fix the Articles, and that meant creating a central government with real power, the power to tax, the power to regulate trade, the power to fund a military. The big debate wasn't if they should do it, but just how much power they should hand over from the states. And what came out of that emergency meeting? The United States Constitution. At its core, it was a direct answer to the economic catastrophe of the 1780s. It created a government that could actually manage an economy, pay its debts, and project strength. You could almost say it was an economic rescue plan, disguised as a new government. But this whole thing leaves us with a massive question they wrestled with then, and honestly, we still argue about today. In fixing a government that was way too weak, did they risk creating one that would become way too strong? The whole constitutional experiment was a huge gamble. Could you build a government powerful enough to stop a bankruptcy without recreating the very tyranny you just fought a war to escape? Finding that balance, that's still the central challenge of the American system.